Good evening. Yeah. Welcome, welcome. Hope everyone is doing well. See some familiar faces here and some familiar names. Thank you all for being here. My name is Erica Jenkins, and I am the Manager of Annual Giving and Alumni Relations in the School of Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event in our Centennial Conversation series titled Education in the Global Context. Before we kick things off, I just have a few quick housekeeping items to share. And if you've joined us for the last Centennial Conversation, this will all sound very familiar, so just bear with me for a moment. For the best Zoom experience, please switch over to Speaker View, which is located in the upper right-hand side of your screen. We found that this is just the best format for this type of event so that the speaker is front and center, rather than seeing a bunch of little boxes with all the participants. And secondly, we currently have attendees muted, but once we get into the Q&A and conversation portion of the event, please make sure you're muted if you're not speaking. You also have the ability to send a message via chat if you have a question for the panelists. And there is a raise hand feature that should be located at the bottom of your screen under reactions. So feel free to use that tool as well if you'd like to say something. With that, it's my pleasure to hand the Zoom over to our Dean, Elizabeth Burmoji.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Erica. And a round of applause for Erica and her teammates in our Office of Development and Advancement and Alumni Relations. They're wonderful. They've done such great work in putting together these incredible Centennial series. And so I'd like to welcome you all to the third event of the School of Education Centennial series. It's a conversation we've planned with a fabulous panel, and I'm really grateful that so many of you are here with us today to discuss critical topics that will help inform our next 100 years. The Centennial is a unique opportunity to reflect on the history of the school. Considering the ways we have advanced excellent, just, and equitable education, while acknowledging moments in which we missed opportunities to do so or even contributed to education's problems. We're thrilled to provide these opportunities to learn from School of Education scholars and to engage around our collective expertise as we envision the future of our school and the future of education in the coming century. Now, this evening, our focus is on education in the global context, as Erica said. In celebrating global education, we want to also recognize the many nations within the United States and acknowledge the university's origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabe people, who are the fire peoples, the three fires people of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, or as some people would say, the Potawatomi, along with their neighbors, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. We further acknowledge that our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands that were obtained, generally in unconscionable ways, from Indigenous peoples. Knowing where we are changes neither the past nor the present. However, through scholarship and pedagogy, we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present supports human flourishing and justice while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. Now, please join me in welcoming our amazing panelists, our current faculty members, Dr. Michelle Bellino, Dr. Vilma Mesa, and Dr. Kevin Miller. Now, for the sake of brevity, we sent you their full biographies in advance, and we beseech you to read them because they are incredible scholars, and you'll hear that in this conversation tonight. I'm also honored to welcome our panel moderator, Dr. Jan Lawrence, Emerita faculty member in the School of Education. Jan doesn't know this, but she showed up at a prior Centennial conversation, and I thought, let's rope Jan in to some additional work for the school, additional service. And that's actually really appropriate because Jan was always an incredible scholar and colleague in our School of Education. Dr. Lawrence served as Associate Dean from 1990 to 1995 and as Director of the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education from 1996 to 2000. Her scholarship and teaching in international education were truly instrumental in sustaining global education initiatives in our school during a time when really few others were focused on them. I think Jan would agree that we had transitioned from a stronger focus on global education to a space where we were focusing more nationally. And Jan maintained that vibrant global connection. So we're thrilled to have her with us tonight and are grateful for the many ways she has shaped today's opportunities for faculty and students to engage in this work. We're going to begin with a panel discussion, and that will be moderated by Jan with questions that you've already submitted. And then we'll jump into an open discussion with your questions about global education. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Bellino, Mesa, Miller, and Lawrence. Over to you, Jan.
Okay, well, thank you for those kind words, Elizabeth. I want to share your heartfelt sense of the, it's really heartwarming to see the number of people who join the conversation tonight and who share our interests in international and global education issues. Before we start the panel discussion, I would like to also acknowledge the breadth of expertise that's represented not only in the panel, but in the registrants for this conversation. And I want to encourage everyone to please raise a hand, shoot a message, jump up and down. Erica will see you, but please join in the conversations. The more we can make this a conversation, the better it will be. So, with those few words, I'm going to begin tonight's discussion by having the panelists say a few words, brief words, about the nature of their work outside the United States, the kinds of collaborations they're involved in, the kinds of collaborations that make this work possible, and also what attracted them to the particular settings in which they work. Michelle, this is unfair, but we'll go in alphabetical order if you don't mind.
Sure, I'm happy to get us started and really excited to be here, as Jen said, in such good company. I consider myself part of two fairly linked fields of scholarship, one being anthropology of education and the other being comparative and international education. And so doing work in sites outside of the US and thinking transnationally and looking for transnational linkages is sort of core to both of these fields. And within those spaces, I've been really drawn to the educational experiences of young people, both in and outside of schools, in contexts that are impacted by armed conflict and displacement. And one of the things that really interests me about these contexts is that these are settings where the conditions of conflict, and in some cases, the formalized processes that are aimed at peace building, transitional justice, or asylum seeking, distinctly shape young people's educational experiences. They undoubtedly shape access, often hindering access, disrupting access. They permeate educational structures. Sometimes they are integral to conflict dynamics or entwined with reasons and strategies used during migration. They inform and in some cases constrain curriculum and pedagogy and school norms and on and on. And so in these settings, I've been really interested in how young people develop a sense of who they are and who they can be as civic actors, how they learn what it means to participate actively and critically as a citizen in a society, often a democracy, that is experiencing conflict or instability or actively trying to break from and transition from a period of historical injustice. And I'm interested in better supporting young people in reaching their potential goals for social justice within the constraints and limitations of their contexts, which can vary greatly. So this is the nature of my work. I'll just say briefly, because I know we'll talk a little bit more about collaborations, that collaboration is, I think, essential to every project that I have in motion right now. So it will be really hard for me not to name like a million collaborators. And I think collaborators and the opportunity to partner and learn from and learn with and work with folks around the world is one of the things that really gets me attracted to the particular settings where I work. So I have an ongoing youth participatory action research collaboration set in Kenya in Kakuma refugee camp around post-secondary transitions. I have an ongoing collaboration with a wonderful team in Bogota, Colombia, looking at teacher and students' experiences of a peace education policy in the context of a tenuous peace process. And then some newer work in process with colleagues around educational experiences of Central American youth in transit, with attention to the impact of large-scale outward youth migration and return, often forced return, involuntary return on communities of origin.
Okay, thank you very much. Vilma, how about you?
Okay, thank you, Jan. And thank you, everyone. Like Michelle, I'm very excited to be here and happy that there are so many people here as well. My research is a little bit different than Michelle's. I have been collaborating with scholars mainly from Colombia and Chile in various capacities, mostly as consultant, as advisor of different research projects from K-12, from elementary education to post-secondary education. The reason, so the question that I want to focus more is what drew me to this context. And the main for me is that I am Colombian, so I grew up in Bogota, and my first research experience came when I was right out of undergraduate school. I'm a mathematician and computer science major, and there was the possibility of doing a research project in undergraduate education. It was the first time, had no idea what we were doing, but we had a lot of fun. So basically we had developed this curiosity for what happens in the classroom, like what it can be done differently in mathematics that can bring people to understand the beauty of and the fun that you can have. That mathematics can be play rather than pain. So we had some sort of carte blanche, if you will, because we worked with courses that in the math department nobody wanted to teach, and that gave us the opportunity to do a lot of experimentation. And we, in some ways, discovered a lot of the things that we later came to study more intentionally with graduate degrees. So in many ways, I feel compelled to give back to the place that made me in some ways and planted the seeds for who I am. It draws me like intensely to recognize that I am here. Thank you to those early experiences. The second collaboration that I have and has been going very strong and growing in the number of collaborators that I'm having is with Chile. Thanks to some serendipitous encounters and some not so. The most important one for me right now is with Sergio Celis, who is at the University of Chile, and he's right now here, with whom I have been working for the longest time. He, as you may know, he's a graduate from our Center of Higher Education program in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. And he was in my research group, and we have been collaborating since in various projects in Chile, also as a consultant. And I have other collaborations, mostly developing, supporting faculty who are, researchers that are interested in doing educational research in the post-secondary settings, understanding instruction, understanding effectiveness of different tools to assess the impact of different initiatives. So that's what draws me, is this sense of responsibility towards these communities. In the collaboration that I have in Colombia right now, they have several projects, and one of them has to do with curating analyzing the use by communities in Latin America of various resources that are made available for free for across Latin America. So the infrastructure, the research infrastructure for educational research in Latin America is not that well developed as in other countries. In some countries are better developed, like Brazil and Argentina and Chile, Colombia. They have a longer tradition of supporting educational research. So in many ways, I feel compelled that we could provide more collaborations in that sense, in the exchange of information about how educational research can be made meaningful in those places. Let me see. Yes, I think that's good enough to begin.
Okay, thank you very much. Kevin?
So almost all the work that I've done, and I guess everything I'm going to talk about here tonight, involves the United States and China. I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and I've always been interested in how you separate out the active contributions children make to their own development from the environments that they're in. And that's hard to do within any one society, because there are a lot of things that are standard in a particular country about our beliefs about children, the way we educate them, what we think they need to learn, and so on, that only differ across countries. And one thing I want to mention that I've been doing recently, in part because Jan was involved in my first effort doing this, is taking students from Michigan to China, and more recently hosting students from the two universities we work in there, so Beijing Normal and Shanxi Normal University in Xi'an here. And one of the things that's quite striking to me are the things that people notice about the other society. So one comment that was really striking from one of the Beijing Normal students in the last time they came, so I guess almost 2 years ago now, was they were surprised that all of the classes and all the talks they went to seemed to be focusing on identity development, which really isn't a topic in Chinese psychology, where at least if you're interested in adolescence in the US, it's kind of the topic. And so that was really quite striking for everyone to think about. And another thing that brings up these different ideas about who people are and how they can learn. We've done some research in both places looking at the kind of impact of the impression a teacher makes on student learning, because there's some belief that you can look at just a few seconds of a college class and predict the course evaluations that instructors will get, which of course is terrifying to all of us who get those evaluations. And so we tried to look at that systematically, by having videos where somebody makes a terrible impression, but then gives a good lecture, or vice versa, and so on. And one of the really interesting things that we found when we did this in China, from the previous work, we'd taken a whole lot of adjectives that you'd have to evaluate the person on, is that the students felt that the teacher who did a bad job was dishonest, which American teachers mostly don't. And I think this connects to some deep beliefs that for some reason Americans don't have, that by and large, anybody can learn to do anything. That we think if somebody's a bad teacher, well, okay, you should find something else to do, rather than you didn't put in the work to learn how to do this. And obviously, in part, this relates to the freedom that people have about job opportunities and so on. But the idea that, deep down, we believe that everybody can learn something. And so therefore, if you fail, it means you haven't put enough work in it, and we need to help you to do that, is something we espouse in the School of Education, but I think it's not something that Americans as a whole tend to believe. Let me end with, I hope this hasn't been too long. There's a popular Chinese expression, 井底之蛙, that just means a frog in the bottom of a well. And the idea is a frog in the bottom of the well can't tell you anything about the sea. And I think in important ways, we're all, as a society, but obviously also as individuals, particularly these days, at the bottom of our own well. And finding ways to break out of that, to see from the experience of others, is really powerful, both in providing new things that we can try and adopt, but also giving a different perspective on things that we've taken for granted. So let me stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you. You set up nicely the next question that we had, which is a rather logical one. Michelle, what are you learning from the work you've been doing? And as a result of your work, what do you think the benefits will be for the people overseas with whom you work, as well as for the School of Education?
So, yeah, great question. And I feel like what I'm learning and what I'm hoping to learn and do in each of these contexts is a little bit different. So I'll start with my project that's ongoing in Kenya. Again, in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya on the border with Sudan. And so I've been working in partnership with this group of young people for several years. They are learning and pursuing livelihood opportunities in a context of extreme scarcity and uncertainty, uncertainty around displacement. COVID has added layers to that uncertainty, but also with an abundance of motivation and optimism to learn and to reshape democratic arrangements in their countries of origin, to create societies where conflicts can be resolved peacefully. And in this context where young people are forced to compete so regularly for material needs, for their basic resources, and for their fundamental rights, to see young people coming together in a collaboration like this, in a partnership like this, that's meant to be an active engagement with their community, to create something collective and to collectively mobilize around ways that they can support change in a space that was never meant to be a community. This really inspires me. And this is something I'm learning deeply from my collaborators. I think really concretely, the question we are exploring together and the question that we're trying to learn from is centered on the role of social and academic supports for refugee learners in context of displacement, and especially about information and how information about opportunities and how information about navigating opportunity structures shapes youth motivation and can impact decisions about educational and learning pursuits. I'm hoping that we together will continue to learn how to do this work so that we can better support educational aspirations and experiences of displaced peoples as a group. And I do really want to emphasize that as a group piece. I think that as a group piece is really key to the sort of social justice framing that we have. And I think at sort of a meta level, and this one is, I think I have different, I get different things out of asking this question than my collaborators do in this particular context. So some of this work is attending to, what do transformative and emancipatory research, what could they look like outside the context of a nation state? How might we think about citizenship, identity, and rights and participation in a context where young people lack legal status? And again, I think that's something I'm getting out of this very much from my perspective. In the process, what I hope my collaborators are getting is a lot of capacity building around doing research, and an adult collaborator who is of a different identity and status than them in a lot of ways and can use my positioning to advance our collective work.
Thank you. Vilma? Same question.
Yep. So this is a very interesting question because, as I said, I am very interested in understanding, in creating a way of supporting the development of capacity, also, as Michelle said, in terms of educational research. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is making how can these collaborations can be done without imposing a particular view of what needs to be done. So we understand research because I've been trained here in the United States in doing educational research, and I am an editor of a journal. And then, so in some ways, I sort of am a steward of some of these knowledge. And at the same time, different contexts and different countries may have different ways of seeing the world, understanding research, and different ways of seeing the importance of particular problems. So I am interested in seeing how these collaborations can be done without imposing or without trampling over the knowledge that is generated within these communities, or the ways of knowing and understanding the world. So that is one thing that I'm interested in learning. I'm also interested in seeing readaptations and reinventions of some of the ideas that I have produced here. We have been developing some instruments to observe instruction in post-secondary settings in community colleges. And I am very interested in seeing whether that has any way of being studied, used, adapted, reinvented for their communities. One thing that happens to me a lot, and Sergio and I had this conversation much earlier, is that when we start writing in Spanish, there are so many terms that don't have a name yet. So we create a name, and then are we creating a new idea? Are we reinventing the idea? So people who deal with language, all these things are quite interesting, right? So that's another piece. And more interesting for me is understanding, I would like to know more about the ways in which higher education is seen differently in these other countries. Mostly is seen as a common good. Public education is funded very well in some of the countries. Higher education is free. It's very difficult to enter higher education. But I'm interested in the sort of activism that students and the citizens show, and the willingness and eagerness to learn. So those are things that I'm interested in understanding and learning through the collaborations. So as part of this, I am before the COVID, I was starting, and I had a little discussion with Michelle a long time ago about the possibility of starting a pre-K to undergraduate center that would start creating some sort of corridor between us and Latin America, because this is, for me, language is important, and most of the scholarship that goes to Latin America comes from Europe, thanks to Spain, that has a lot of influence from Europe. So Spain translates, and then, and I think that the way in which some of the things are done in the United States might be more easily adaptable. So I'm interested. So COVID hit, but the plans are that we would be able to create some sort of corridor in which we can create spaces for scholars to come, or for us to go and do exchanges or establish collaborations in different forums.
Thank you. Kevin, it's kind of a continuation of your earlier comments.
Yes.
Since I've worked with you, I'd also really appreciate it if you'd make some observations about how you engage our students, our School of Ed students, in your research.
Yes. So I will say, so I have a joint appointment in LS&A in the School of Education, and the travel that I've done is all gone through the LS&A and the psych department, because they're set up for it, which is one thing that certainly Dean Moji and I've talked about a lot, and we're trying to figure out ways of promoting that in the School of Ed, because I have seen for a lot of the students who've gone that it really can be quite life-changing, that they see things that are really surprising to them. A lot of the students who travel have never been outside the United States before, and the things that, after the year seem quite mundane to me are really, really striking to them. In terms of research, the one thing I thought I would talk about is that, and I also want to argue that I think we would all say that the transfer of knowledge is definitely goes in both directions. So let me try to give one quick example of each. One thing that's always surprising to my Chinese collaborators is that looking at elementary school classes in the United States, particularly in math, is that teachers seem to be doing most of the talking and most of the intellectual work. And had a project where we used some technology that allowed us to give teachers feedback on how much discussion was going on in their classroom and some professional development, both for the teachers and the students, to try to explain how to foster discussion in mathematics. And we were able to show some pretty big effects over a fairly short period of time. At the college level, though, it's a different story. And a lot of the things that we've been doing for the last 20 years to promote, active engagement in class are relatively rare there and really needed. And with our collaboration with the psych departments of Beijing Normal here, they've sent, and the psych department here, they've sent faculty over who've really changed their curriculum quite a bit to actively involve students in research early on and do a lot of the things that are central to the way we educate students. And we're trying to find ways of doing that in the School of Education as well, because it can be quite powerful. And the other thing with the undergraduates, a lot of them have then gone on to do careers involving education, and particularly international education or work in China or so on. So what's really gratifying about this is the way that you can see that it really does change the life course for many of the students who go along on these trips. Let me stop there.
Thanks. A number of you submitted questions to us prior to this conversation, and now turn to some of them. The first one is kind of the elephant in the room question, which was submitted by Dr. Shaheen, I believe. And if this individual is in the group, we would appreciate some, maybe some clarification of the intention. But the question was, what is global in the 21st century in the US? And this is kind of a toss-up question. I'll let any of the panelists who'd like to start initiate the conversation. Michelle? Did I see you? Michelle, are you ready to make a comment?
Yeah, sure. I can take this question. Yeah, I think first, I love this question. I love what it's asking us to do, to sort of trouble what we mean by this concept. Is there even such a thing as anything that's not global right now? Might be another sort of implicit question here. I think that we often, especially in the university context, too easily assume that global means international students for us. Or maybe international, like satellite campuses. I don't think we can locate the global in bodies like that. I think it really needs to be a disposition and an orientation and a set of commitments that we take on as a university. And so, yeah, I'm answering this a little bit more from the university perspective than what global is in the 21st century in the United States. I think one important element here is Preeti Berry the person who asked this question?
No, the person was the last name Shaheen.
Okay, so I'll just say a little bit more, although I see someone has a hand up. So yeah, I think most deeply for me is really thinking about the mutuality of impact, that what happens, quote, over here affects and impacts what's happening, quote, over there, and that these are implicitly connected, and that we, as the United States, also have sort of outsized political and economic impact. And so that's particularly important for us coming from the United States, that our domestic immigration policy can immediately have a global impact on someone's educational experience, or the possibility of them going to school, or what that certification might mean for them. So thinking about those global ramifications for all of the local and national actions.
Okay. Pradeep has his hand raised. If he would like to make an observation, that would be great.
You're still muted. Yeah.
He's still muted, Erica.
You should be able to unmute yourself.
Mute him? Okay.
Okay. This is Berry. I am from Evanston, Illinois. So she married me in about 46 years ago, and he did her doctorate from Columbia. And you know, she always believed the education was one of the best thing, you know, you can possess. And education is educated people are respected everywhere in the world, whether it is India, whether it is anywhere in the world, and no matter.
I think we may be having an issue with your audio, Pradeep. I'm so sorry. Going in and out. Is anyone else experiencing that?
Education, high.
Pradeep, I'm afraid I'm going to mute you.
I just did.
You did? Okay.
And I'll send you a message, Pradeep. I'm so sorry about that. Technical Zoom foibles.
Perhaps you could type in the chat window.
Yeah, his question.
Good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to add a little bit about the idea of global. I have been thinking about this word for a long time because I always wonder who benefits by this global idea. And it seems to me that it might be that the idea of globalization benefits the people who may have control of the means of production of knowledge or resources, or like the people who can decide what is global or not global. And I also think about that word in light of what Elizabeth started our conversation with, the acknowledgement that we are a nation full of nations within. And what does that mean, the idea of global there? Like, so I tend to go with this notion, this word brings me to the idea of colonialism or imposing a particular worldview. And I worry about that word in that sense, the potential of assuming that globalization is a good thing when it might not have, you know, Michelle was alluding a little bit to this when she was saying when we have some resources and means of production and that sort of thing. And it worried, that was one of the worries that I have about the word in itself. On the other hand, as Michelle said, I don't know whether we can step away from it or that we shouldn't do it. Like we are embedded in this space. What we do affects every other piece of our work. And I guess part of the idea of global for me involves also responsibility for what we do and what we can expect people to do, or what we can learn, or how can we collaborate. I mean, there are all these things about how we do things, and I always second guess myself, is this what we should be doing, and why? Why is that I, coming from the United States or the University of Michigan, can provide this information when there is a lot of local knowledge that is so important to understand communities?
Thank you.
I think, yeah, one thing I find useful in thinking about this question, in looking at work internationally, essentially you can either sort of go wide or you can go deep. And a lot of stuff that's done broadly or widely ends up being really shallow and really, you know, picking out, say, one thing that people do here and find connections there. There's a lot of that work done in anthropology and psychology in the last century, and mostly it didn't lead anywhere. And I think the important thing about going deep in a place has, you know, Michelle and Vilma both alluded to, are the connections and relationships that you build with people who can say, well, okay, no, you're full of it about this, or this is wrong, or so on. In the question, for some reason, I was thinking about, you know, after 1492, there was what's called the Great Columbian Exchange, when in addition to all the horrible things that happened to people, there was a huge exchange of plants and animals in particular around the world, so that many of the things that we most associate with a particular place, like say potatoes in Germany or Ireland, weren't from there. or red peppers in Sichuan cooking or so on. The globalization gives us a broader set of choices and ideas that we can draw from, but whether they're going to grow in a particular soil really depends on the context where that is, and understanding that is really requires a lot of understanding and I think a deep collaboration.
Just a follow-up observation to your comment about the superficiality of some of the research. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of glenocal. And if you're not, I encourage you to Google it. It's the idea of people who do treat issues in a superficial way, meaning if you just stop in many instances at what the ministers of education or the policymakers say is going on, those answers fail to detect what's happening down at the local level as different districts and players translate policies and practices to fit with the local needs. So glenocal, if you don't know it, I encourage you to look it up. Another member of the audience, I hope she's here, Josie Whelan asked, do you think the pandemic as a global phenomenon will increase a one-size-fits-all globalistic approach to online learning options? This was directed to you, Michelle, but anyone should feel free to answer.
Sure, I'm going to jump in because, so Josie, I hope you're here. Josie Whelan was a student of mine in the comparative and international education class last winter term. And I think I have a sense of where this question is coming from, but I would love to know more about like what you're seeing, what's really informing that question, what you think might be pushing sort of a one size fits all. Although this really sort of dovetails with what Jan was just saying nicely. So Jan, I know I'm familiar with glocal, which is a term that I don't love, but I don't know glenocal. So I'm gonna have to see if that one gets around some of I think some of the tensions that I and others feel with glocal, which is that like the global and the local sort of fuse together and, you know, produce one single static thing, and all the power differentials are sort of erased in the process. So sort of with that, sort of coming off of that, I do think global forces play a really powerful role in shaping educational policy and practice. I think my sort of go-to answer would be that the global is always going to be interpreted through the lens of the local, through the lens of national needs or local needs, community needs, a teacher in her classroom's needs, the priorities, the assets, the contexts and constraints of that space and of that system. So I imagine that anything that is coming from above, pushing an agenda around virtual or blended options would proliferate globally for sure, but not necessarily be taken up in the same ways. I think that we could probably maybe 100 years into the future, since this is the Centennial conversation, maybe 100 years into the future, we could say that, you know, 2020 with COVID became a real turning point around educational policy, and that states really had to come up with a set of resources and a contingency plan for school closures in the case of crises like this. And so I could see national ministries everywhere sort of implicitly being required to have some kind of online toolkit for teachers, some kind of online training. I still think the technology and infrastructure has proven to be so inequitable and the limiting factor in so many ways for how the technology can get taken up. And I think this is what I keep seeing as impeding a potential globalistic way that this could, that this could get interpreted. But again, I'm so curious if Vilma and Kevin, if you have thoughts, or Josie, if you're here and can say a bit more about where your question's coming from.
My first reaction to answer that question is, oh, I hope not. I hope there is no one size fits all, because I don't think that's ever possible. And so I'm gonna give you an example. So one thing that happened in Colombia because of the COVID, many teachers had to use WhatsApp because they couldn't actually get any other way to communicate with the students. And many teachers had to actually go to school at different times when nobody was there, print the materials, and go to their the homes of their students to deliver the materials. This in rural community, in rural areas, in cities, that's what teachers did. That is very different from, I think, what happened here, in which we assume that everybody would have access to internet. In Colombia, we know that we don't have the infrastructure to support internet for everybody, but people have cell phones, and some people have WhatsApp. So what people, that the communities were really quick and nimble in reorganizing the resources that they had available, and the teachers, with their commitment to their students, found ways that didn't have Zoom to reach their students. One of the things that was very interesting in this process is that they discovered that the parents were learning with the children, because, and that is very important in rural areas in Colombia, because the level of literacy are not uniform across. So what the teachers realized is that they were not just teaching the child, they were teaching the parents or their caregivers or the older brothers and sisters. So this is not a one size fits all. What I see here in the United States is everybody's in their own room, their own computer, people fighting for their computer time in order to be able to get. That's not what happened in the context that we are looking at and studying. That's a very different approach. I haven't asked how happened in Chile, but maybe Sergio can tell us, because I know Sergio's here. But that is something that my first reaction to that question, I hope not. I hope that what we come out from this experience about online learning is that there is not just a one way of learning online. Like the space, really, the classroom is a global classroom, and the people in the classroom are not just the students.
Sergio, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just, well, thank you everyone. And I'm very happy that the School of Education is doing this talk in the Centennial year. It's important. It's important for people like me that was trained in Michigan, and now it's doing research and trying to create knowledge here from the South. And I was thinking about this global definition, and from here we see two global. We see the global North and the global South, and I'm here in the South. And as Vilma say, we look at the global North in a really unbalanced way. I mean, the research that we value is the research that is conducted in the global North. The training that we value is the training that you receive in the global North. The language that we use in our research and its value and all the incentives are put in there are the ones produced in the global North. So it's a real unbalanced way to produce knowledge as a community and understanding the differences. For example, in the topic of the pandemic and internet access, here in Chile, you will see, and it's many countries in the global South, huge inequalities. Well, in the global North as well. So this figure of knowledge created in one side that is more well developed and more rich, and this in the South, start to crack down when you think about the differences within these two globals. But the problem is, like today, we see this phenomenon just from the one perspective, the perspective that you have there, up there. Sorry, using this figure, but that's how we see it. So my question is how we can restore some balance, how we can shatter this, mainstream research that are produced in the law and open up for more different ways of conceiving knowledge and giving more space to what is created here in the South, and understanding, as you were saying, that the South is not a monolithic place. It also has different realities and inequalities, and some places are as much global as places like Michigan, but other places are very, very different conditions. So that's I have been wondering on that as I hear your comments.
Thank you, Sergio. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't point out, I live in New Hampshire now. Across the river is Vermont. Sorry, Diane, you can comment if you'd like. But in Vermont, there's not an access to the internet that enables the students to do the lessons that the state's mandating. And we know that's true in other contexts as well. So it's not as if in the global north, everybody has the same access to the kind of technological infrastructure that makes it possible. Sorry, I picked on Vermont. You know, we could have picked on.
Well, no, but I think that's right. And in fact, there's, access and broadband to broadband is a big, big issue in this state because of its rural nature. So, but I think a lot of people, certainly living in towns, can access it. And now with the infrastructure bill, if it comes passed, that's one of the priorities in this state, is to ensure that everybody has access, and it's so important these days. Sorry, New Hampshire.
Okay, related to the
May I? Excuse me, can I make a quick comment? I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when we're thinking global too, for example, in Chile or the United States or anywhere, not everyone in those particular countries or populations receive or think globally the same. So for like an indigenous group in the United States, they'll totally think differently when it comes to global, or the indigenous groups in Chile, like in general, it's the mestizo or the criollo in Latin America, who is getting the main benefits from any globalization, in my opinion. So there's different populations all over the world that view globalization different ways, so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we speak about our own populations, that people view it differently, because, for example, I was able to travel, and I traveled, I would argue, safer than what maybe an African-American might travel. Like if an African-American goes to China, or an African or anyone, you're going to have tons of Chinese people trying to sneak pictures of them. So just everyone experience global in different ways. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind, no matter what population we're talking about or what country. Thank you. That's it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the observation. Another question related to the pandemic had to do with deficits in education that may follow from this terrible situation. And Vilma pointed out appropriately the loaded nature of a number of the concepts in this question, which was, how will the deficits in education during the pandemic be resolved? Kevin?
Yeah, let me say something about that. Our former colleague, Fred Morrison, did this really interesting research where he would look at children who were born right around the cutoff age for entering kindergarten, wherever they were. So you'd look at kids who were about the same age within a month or two, but differed by a year of schooling. And unsurprisingly, the kids who don't go to kindergarten this year are still learning things. They learn a lot of math, for example, just by going through the world and building things and competing with their siblings, or all the stuff that one does. So the idea that children are doing nothing is certainly wrong. And what's going to happen is really remains to be seen. Now, I had just a very informal observation. One thing I noticed this past year as I walked around Ann Arbor is that you would see kids by themselves going out and playing and exploring, which is something that in middle class the United States had become quite rare. The kids would have time to sort of go out and do things on their own and get in trouble and hopefully get out of it. So it remains to be seen what kids learned, what they failed to learn, and how schools can help them get back where the schools expect them to be. But the idea that there's a deficit, or that even performance on a test the day you come back is going to show that you didn't learn X last year, is something I would be really loath to endorse.
Others?
I wanted to pick up both Sergio's question and John's comments. I think it's related a little bit with what Kevin was saying, but maybe not, in the sense that because it's this idea that Sergio was saying that in the global South tend to look at the global North as an example. And then John was saying, well, different people may interpret the global differently. Like, depending on the circumstances, the global may have a very different meaning. So it makes me wonder how do we convey those messages that the North is quote unquote better than the South, or the productions in the North are better than in the South? And that is interesting to me. And I don't know how to answer the question, other than maybe we some people have more power to disseminate their worldview throughout the world, and assuming that must be the way. And we have been subjected to some forms of colonialism forever, so that might be an expression of that. But it may be that there might be the possibility of contrasting what we're doing in our own contexts when we go into another place is so illuminating. Kevin was mentioning this at the beginning. We understand things differently because we're moving out from the bottom of the well. Now we're going to a different well or a different beach or a different ocean, and then we understand things differently from our own context that we couldn't see because we were moving. So when John is saying we are going in the global changes from the experience, I think that's part of it. And that's one of the things that I'm always curious, like, is this global, the idea that there is going to be only one worldview? And that worries me. Like, I worry that then everything is going to be so homogeneous that there is not going to be any diversity, and that worries me. I think that also is implicit in John's comment, like, we really want this diversity. So Sergio, I don't have an answer to your question, and I would hope that we, with time, have more norths and more souths and more easts and more wests to understand our own work and how we see the world. I don't know. I feel I'm rambling now.
Well, I would ramble a minute and just say that on one of my trips overseas, I'm coming back to your comment, Vilma, about opening people's perspectives. I was really taken aback by the fact that some of the students on the trip had a very difficult time. In fact, I would say found it impossible to be open to views of decolonization that were different from one that they had kind of formulated before they went to that country. And I would be open and would love to hear observations from others who've taken students on trips and may have encountered a similar kind of resistance to students. They're not automatically open. And when they're not open, it's a challenge. And so I'd be curious if others have encountered this issue, and if they have, how they have dealt with it or responded to it. No one? Anne, John, you didn't?
Yes, this is a question for
Anne and John? Sure.
Yeah, I've brought students abroad when I was a high school teacher. And sometimes it drives you nuts because it is very challenging. But I'll tell you the same, it's just as challenging with adults. So age doesn't really matter. I've been with both. So I took 8 kids to Costa Rica, and I taught Spanish, and also I took a group to Spain and France, and I was it was amazing because the boys they handle it much better. They're willing to eat the local food, and the girls, they were just really kind of freaked out about the bugs too much. And I don't want to stereotype. I mean, that's what I observed from these 8 students, and also. They weren't so open about eating different types of food in general. So, but I was really pleased when I got back home because Well, when we got back home, one of the girls came up to me and she goes, you know, Mr. Walker, I'm really glad you took us on that trip. You know, we're talking about going ourselves someday. So yeah, it was stressful for me. And, you know, you see, I don't have a lot of hair, you know, from, so, but in the end, just to hear that was worth it. And to make Vilma feel better about, there are some things that are very stereotypical as far as globalization goes, but also if you use the US as an example, I work with a lot of people from all over the world. And I would tell you this, most people love their own country in general. And if you talk to Argentinian,
Oh, yeah.
they love their own country. You talk to a Brazilian, I'm married to a Brazilian.
I'm married to an Argentinian, and I know how much he loves his country.
Yes, yes. So when a lot of people, we have so many different subgroups in the United States, and they're a little different. You know, we're mostly the same, but we're a little different. But I would argue that, especially in the Western world, that we are mostly the same in general. And we have some differences that make us a little unique. But a lot of people hold on to these differences. It's their children who'll become more stereotypical Americans or Brazilians if they grow up in Brazil. You know, but if you come here at an older age, you're going to hold on to a lot of what you came with when you came here at an older age. So.
Thank you. I saw Anne and John raising a hand.
Sure. Yes, hi Jan and everyone. It's very nice to be here with everybody. We're talking to you from Michigan State, and we have been very involved for more than 20 years with South Africa, beginning with a year-long Fulbright more than 20 years ago, where as a family with young children, we lived in South Africa, and we've been able to continue with deep, deep connections, almost yearly interactions for John, and at least every other year for me. And both of us have had a lot of times taking students to South Africa. The comment I wanted to make at this part of the conversation, am I doing okay?
Yeah, it's automatically typing.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Okay, great. I didn't want to be interrupting someone else.
Yeah.
This is such an interesting conversation, and I wanted to, as I was, your invitation about the opportunity to have students go to other countries, I wanted to comment on, and I wanted to combine it with a comment I believe that Vilma made earlier, which was the challenge of how to collaborate without imposing on colleagues and people that we interact with in another country. How do we actually do that? I take graduate students in higher education, and it's not so much a study tour. We plan for about 6 months in collaboration with our colleagues, our longtime colleagues at a university in South Africa. And we mutually, with our colleagues there, identify a common area of interest. An example would be moving toward more active learning. What does that mean? And it means different things in each of our contexts. So we spend time with our colleagues in South Africa and here with our students, you know, thinking together about what does this question mean in our context. And then we work together in mutual ways, kind of mutual learning. So the point I wanted to make is that indeed, many of the students, I've had some students who have not been overseas until we had this experience. But one of the things I have found to be helpful is to try to frame the whole experience around the question of what does it mean to be a learner, so that we're entering the environment to learn as much as to contribute, and to expect our colleagues on the other country to be contributing to us and to be learning, so that the whole experience is organized around mutual learning. And so that, I think, has really helped us all to be both sharers of whatever we might know, but really open to new ways to understand issues that we're trying to explore. The other thing I wanted to say related to that is that, and this relates, I think, to some things that Kevin mentioned earlier. Of course, many of us travel briefly to other places, and we are enriched, and hopefully we contribute. But I do think there's a great deal to be said for long-time relationships and for immersing oneself in those relationships, because it's over time that I liken it to an onion, that you kind of take off one layer, you start to think you know something and you realize no, and then you go to the next layer. So I think the opportunity to embed some of our educational experiences, especially with our students, in long-term relationships where we're all striving to really listen and learn, it is a very nice opportunity to be able to have.
Yeah, and let me just add that, as Ann said, since 1998, I've had the pleasure of team teaching a course in South Africa almost every single year. And it's always with South African students sitting side by side with my American students when taking Americans on that specific trip. One thing I would say is that one thing about globalism is that there's no question that global capitalism has changed dramatically what is going on in every space in which it operates. So that there's a number of examples where, in effect, local industries in South Africa have been wiped out by US industries coming in, or on the other side, that South African capital has actually moved into the United States or Europe or elsewhere. So I think that the idea that we believe in education, that we can do one thing, that's absolutely true. But there's no question that the economic imperative that is going on, that has a huge effect on what we do within classrooms, what we do within school systems, what we do within universities, that still is going on out there and has a huge effect on that kind of globalism that we're all seeing.
Thank you, John. I want to go back to Pradeep right now to see if his microphone's better, but I hope you and I can pick up on that and have the conversation in terms of what education may be doing in order to push back on some of the influences of the economic imperatives. Pradeep, let's hope your connection is better. Unmute.
Pradeep, you should be able to unmute. You should have access to that.
There you go.
There you go.
Pradeep, I think you're unmuted now.
You see, education will never deprive you. Education will never deprive you, no matter where you are. It is just a function of how you proceed with your education, what your expectations are. Sometimes, when we get the education from a top college, we think, oh my God, we are on top of the thing. Unless you fail, you will never succeed. Hang around in the barber shop and you will get a haircut. It has taken a lot of time, for people who have a lot of education. But if they think that education will take them right away to on the ocean, it is not. Sometimes our expectations is so high that we presume. Now 90% of the people, the families, they insert in their children that you have to become a doctor, you have to become a doctor, you have to become a doctor. And if they don't become, they are disappointed. So education is not only for a degree or for a thing. Education is basically meant for the humanity. The number one, if there's no humanity, there's no humanity thing. Education tells you how to live, sustain your life, and then succeed, basically. Education never fails. We fail. Something is wrong with you. Our personality sometimes, basically does not get along, we have ego. Sometimes we cannot get along. Now I was listening to this, your program that you took some students, it's very difficult for the students to help because we have to basically teach them. We have to give them confidence. We have to give them a confidence. Yes, we are basically, if they are uncomfortable, just like a small child, only thing they like, just like a smile, just smile.
When we were
there is a lot. When
we were discussing the question of globalization earlier, I think it was Elizabeth made the observation about deficit. The deficit is not the children. The deficit is what we do. And I sense that in a way, that's the point you're making in a different way. And I appreciate that a great deal. I'm looking at the time and I hate to break up. We only have 5 minutes left. The last question that we had that came from the participants prior to the meeting was, what do you think a globally situated and conscious school of education would look like? And what would it do? In a way, I think that's a great question to end with the panelists as well as the rest of the group that's been participating tonight. Kevin, you're unmuted. Do you have something you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, one thing I would like to see is preparing our students to work in other countries in this. And I will say, this is partly my own experience. My daughter is a graduate of the LMAC program and taught in Beijing and Tokyo for a couple of years, and then currently is an ELL teacher in Ann Arbor. And I think having the experience of understanding different teaching cultures and students in other places is really important, because in any classroom you go in the United States, you're very likely to have children from all over the world. But also it does really broaden the sense you have of what the possibilities are for children, and the ways in which how someone presents today may be very different than what they ultimately become. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, I love that idea, Kevin. I have a few ideas. I'm not sure how connected they're going to sound, but let me just sort of name them. They're all things I really feel passionate about and would love to talk to anyone in the room more about them. So I think we are in a time of unprecedented global migration, and this means that our schools are diversifying. Our society is changing. The nature of education, the way we conceptualize and design learning opportunities might change in tandem with these realities. Vilma, I think you posed this really interesting question about how the global north is seen as like the norm or the sort of default. I mean, it's power, it's so much power over so much time. And Elizabeth began this talk by, mentioning that there are times when education has been at fault, right? Where education has not promoted diversity, inclusion, justice, and equity, but education was actually an instrument of coloniality. And so naming and recognizing, squarely in our DHE agenda as a school of education, the enduring coloniality that's tethered to education systems and the harms that have been done to various communities, indigenous communities in particular, around the world, by importing Western education systems because they were presumed to be better. So we need to own that history and also work together to reconcile that history. Sort of coming back to some of what Sergio was saying, this problematic divide that exists between sort of donor and recipient researchers. I think as an institution, I think we have a real responsibility to build the kinds of partnerships that a lot of us have talked about building, opportunities for students that are mutual and reciprocal, but also research partnerships and opportunities to build knowledge together and create knowledge together. I think that I just want to name that we have the ESL endorsement in our teacher education program. And I think that's been a really interesting step for us in terms of recognizing that like those kids over there are also our kids, and that we are all in this together, that there are some things they're going to need hemispheric or regional or global responses. Some responses can't just be contained within one space. And then the last thing I'll say is the Global Education Discussion Group, which Donald Freeman and I co-founded, and Melinda Richardson has been a really integral role. And so that just naming some of the spaces where this kind of conversation is happening is really important for us to think about, continuing to support those spaces and ensure that they thrive and grow. All right, I'll stop now. Thank you so much.
Vilma?
Yes, so the advantage of going last is that most of the interesting things have been already said. But I would like to add a couple of things. So I agree with Michelle. We have tremendous responsibility in knowing and owning what we have done to the world with imposing our imposition of ways of seeing the world and assuming that that's the best or the way in which everybody should be doing things. I also think that I would see our school as also picking up on something that Pradeep said, which is recognizing the humanity. Now that we have so much migration all over the world, I think recognizing humanity is very important. And if we could be leaders in that way, how we conceive education as understanding the needs of the individual rather than that person or them or those, that would be something amazing. And the last thing, we are academics. I'm an engineer, a mathematician too, and I tend to take things as if they were technical problems. These are not technical problems. These are moral and ethical questions that we're confronting. And when we understand that, then we will be able to, be responsible, be aware, own our mistakes, and be responsible for what comes in the future, and be a little bit humble and open to what may come.
Wonderful way to end. I now get to turn the meeting over to Elizabeth. We are almost on time.
We are wonderfully on time. Thank you, Jan, for your incredible moderating. And thank you to all our panelists and all our participants. I think this has just been an incredibly rich discussion. And really, Vilma's comments at the end remind us how important it is as educators to think about humanity and to really foreground, what is good and what we value about other human beings, and how we can start with, sharing our privilege and not, trying to take over the education landscape. And I want to build on something that Michelle said as well. She very nicely promoted our English as a second language endorsement. And I would love to see a time when our educator preparation programs and all our programs actually help to break the hold on monolingualism in our country, and actually advance the idea that everyone should speak more than one language. I think we would really advance our, our breakdown of this notion of global and national boundaries if we could actually cross those language boundaries and barriers. So with that, I want to thank you all for just incredibly rich discussion. I want to thank Jan for making this a really interactive conversation. Sometimes we can plan a conversation, but it really becomes about the panelists speaking only. And this was really nice how we went back and forth. I hope that you also felt inspired by this and will come to our next Centennial conversation. The next event is going to be at the end of May. We're not giving you the date because we want you to hang on the edge of your email. Actually, we're not giving you the date because we haven't quite finalized it yet, but it will be about an exciting new foray that our School of Education is going to take into the next century, and to think about how we can expand education opportunity and access and affordability by really building more online offerings, and how we can do that in a way that maintains the integrity of what we have to offer, but also invites more people into conversation with us. And we're using this incredible experience that we have all had in the last year as a launch pad, because we've all built out of necessity the digital platforms and digital offerings, and we think that we can really advance something new and different. We'll also be talking about exploring artificial intelligence and extended reality tools, and really thinking about what does the next century hold for us in education. So I hope you'll all join us. I know that Erica will make sure that you all have the information about this final conversation for this academic year in our Centennial series. I want to also let you know that because of the pandemic, we've decided to delay some of our Centennial events so that we can try to have some things in person. So if you're in the area in the fall, if you're planning to be back for homecoming or any other activities, we hope you'll join us for all the different kinds of Centennial events that we will be offering. And more on that in the coming Hail Mail messages that you'll be getting, and Michigan Education Magazine, and all our other forms of communication. So stay tuned. Make sure that you read those when you get them in your email. I'd like to ask you to share stories, memories, or photos at a link that I think Erica will put in the chat if she hasn't already. SOE Alumni Relations at umich.edu. We'd love to feature you in our stories. And you don't have to be an alumnus of the school to have your story featured. We'd really like to see all the stories that we can tell about our friends of the School of Education over the last 100 years. And if any of you has been around for those 100 years, we really want to know about it. So let us know, in addition, what you think we should be doing to celebrate our milestone of the Centennial, and to remember that we're celebrating not just our past, but how we move forward, how we become better, and how we are stronger than ever. So thank you for joining us all tonight. I'll turn it over to Erica just in case she has any last words, because she is in charge.
I think we covered all of the bases. Thank you all so much for attending. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye, everybody. Go Blue.